The Brussels Report Podcast.
Welcome to a new episode of the Brussels Report podcast. My name is Peter Kleppe. I'm the editor-in-chief of brusselsreport.eu, and it's very good to have as my guest today Brad Lips, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Atlas Network, which is serving a global community of more than 550 civil society organizations that are dedicated to individual liberty and free markets. So welcome, Brad.
Yeah, no, thank you, Peter.
Yes, my pleasure. So I think maybe first a bit about Atlas. Atlas, I would say, is the leading network of, as I described it, civil society organizations, think tanks, NGOs that are dedicated to individual liberty, free markets. So maybe you want to introduce that a little bit to the listeners, because I think it's a very important organization.
No, thank you for that. It's a wonderful place to have been spending the last 25 years now. I've had this kind of quarter century tenure with an organization that I think does play a really pivotal role in the future of liberty. And we do that by having this bottom-up model where we're working with independent organizations all around the world that have a common vision of why we need to protect the dignity and freedom of the individual, why we need to be skeptical of big government encroachments on that. And Atlas serves those organizations through training by creating grant opportunities, thanks to our generous donors, and then by bringing these organizations together to learn from one another, because we really think that innovation is spurred by getting excited about, what the groups in Burundi are doing, what the groups in Chile are doing. There's some really wonderful work for liberty happening around the world, and we think we can all get a little bit more ambitious, a little bit more effective if we're feeling like a real community cheering each other on.
Okay, wonderful. Now, on Brussels Report, you wrote a comment about pro-liberty education, how it's key to lower Europe's cost of living, and of course, inflation is at the top of everybody's mind in Europe at the moment. Maybe you want to develop that a little bit. So you're talking about Italy in this comment, where 80% of transport companies are publicly controlled, and of course here in Europe we can all in every country cite examples of this. So maybe you could develop a little bit your thoughts on indeed how changing the public mindset is, of course, at the end of the day, key to foster political change in the end.
Yeah, I was just coming back from having spent some time in Prague, where we convened our annual sort of summit of all the pro-liberty groups we work with across Europe, and there we were celebrating the work by Epicenter, based in Brussels, but working collaboratively with a lot of our partners, in fact. And they'd done this wonderful project to sort of raise awareness about the cost of living crisis and the things that could be done to help alleviate it. And it seemed to me it was kind of timely to do this piece, which really goes back to first principles in a way. Our problems can really seem overwhelming when you look at the headlines about just how consumers are feeling pinched and the geopolitical uncertainty that we have and all that. But there's a Ronald Reagan line from the very beginning of his career that I've always loved, where he said, I guess it goes like this. It goes, they say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. Not an easy answer, but simple. And he then goes on to explain some of those building blocks for free societies. And that's what I talk about in my article, the same principles that Adam Smith described as providing he called it a simple system of natural liberty, talking about peace, easy taxes, fair administration of justice with the presumption of liberty. And we're seeing how our community of nonprofit partners can create value and alleviate some of these problems by just recognizing that there are ways to reform the system. You talked about in Italy, our partner has been working to remove some of the government monopolies in public transport that decrease competition. And of course, when you create competition, you create downward pressure on prices and provide opportunity for citizens to spend less on that and more on the things that they're finding difficult to afford. So, it's there's not a silver bullet, but there is sort of a North Star that we can follow if we want to power a lot of reform efforts in the right direction. And I think those things can add up and really make a difference.
Mm. And so, what would you say from your experience? Because you've been working for so many years with partners, both in the States and in Europe. So what would you say are the biggest differences in trying to get political change between those two places?
Yeah, I guess that sometimes I think there's more similarities than differences, because right now I think you have here in the U.S. where I'm based, and certainly have in Europe, a sort of mostly leftist elite that seems out of touch and that governs from a distance. In reaction to that, you're starting to see a growing number of populist movements. Sometimes those turn in what I'd say is an unfortunate direction towards sort of identity politics and a burn it down psychology that's not very helpful. But one of the things that I think is really fantastic here in the U.S. is that you do have many Americans that are engaged in providing the kind of answer that we're a part of, an effort to popularize a different narrative that we can try to roll back government, but do so sort of in the name of universalist principles, leaning on the kind of institutions that really are important for free societies to flourish over time. There is sort of a well-developed ecosystem around promoting these ideas, and I think we need more efforts like this in Europe. We're certainly excited by some of the growth that we see among the partner community that Atlas works with in Europe, but I think we're really at the tip of the iceberg, and I wish more people felt that there was a real opportunity and they sensed better the need to get engaged in this project.
Yeah, no, I think that's also my feeling, that this ecosystem, as you say, is much more developed in the States. Of course, the state has the States is built on individual liberty, so in that sense, it's perhaps not a surprise. But I mean, what always comes back, of course, is money in these kind of discussions, and what would you say is is sort of the reason why it seems so much easier, at least from from a European perspective, to raise money for pro-liberty causes in the States than in Europe? Or perhaps Europeans are wrong to assume it's so much easier.
Yeah, I think that there are some built-in advantages here in the States, that we have sort of charitable law that encourages people. You can reduce your taxes a certain extent by being more active in philanthropy. I think that in Europe, so much of maybe the political parties continue to play a bigger role, and in some cases you have efforts to reform policy that are funded directly by political parties, and people therefore sort of keep a distance and figure that's not something that needs individual support, or it's something outside of what I can participate in. But I think those are those shouldn't carry the day. I just mentioned how a month ago I was in Prague for our Europe Liberty Forum. I just back from South Africa, where we had our Africa Liberty Forum. And there's one wonderful group comes to mind from Burundi called the Center for Development and Enterprise Great Lakes. And they kind of take away all the excuses that organizations, in the US, in Europe, will cite when they say, oh, it's so difficult to raise money. Like, hey, these guys in Burundi, one of the poorest countries in the world, are getting sort of in-kind donations to use office space for their meetings. They're hustling to develop sort of a membership structure so that people want to be a part of their community and learn economics, get involved in trying to power reforms. If you can do it in Burundi, we shouldn't have trouble doing it in Germany, right? So I think that maybe it's time to roll up our sleeves and try to really take it as our own obligation to sound this call and remind people how important it is to be standing up for civilization in this way by respecting the governing frameworks that protect liberty and foster innovation.
No, absolutely. True point. If the Africans can already manage, in such a struggling context, then surely in Western Europe it should be possible. And I mean, there are some examples here, but I don't know. Like it cannot be denied that this continues to be like a massive challenge for many organizations. I guess it's a bit of, like you say, crowding out of the by the public sector. We have such a massive political sector in my own country, Belgium. Political parties they are immensely wealthy. They get lots of taxpayers' money. In Germany, the same. They have their own think tanks that they fund. So I would say a lot of the people that are interested in going into think tanky business in NGOs, academia, are in taxpayer funded groups. So maybe that's one explanation then, I guess.
Yeah. The incentives are really tough. Well, one other thing that makes me hopeful is that that there has been a silver lining to the horror taking place in Ukraine. And that's that we've really been inspired by the organizations we've worked with in the past inside Ukraine that in some cases pivoted to do some humanitarian work a little bit beyond their normal scope. But I think that by doing the targeted humanitarian stuff they did, which was essentially saying, we know that these hospitals in this community lack insulin. How do we source this? And Atlas got to play a role in helping find what they needed and get it where it was lacking in a way that some of the bigger humanitarian groups couldn't do. But by seeing the groups inside Ukraine sort of stand up during this emergency, during the war, they're having a bigger voice as the Ukrainian government thinks about its ongoing needs and the economic policies that will eventually help it thrive. And there's a growing recognition that it's dangerous to just rely on donations from Western governments. We need to become a place to invest, save. And Ukrainian citizens, I think, are increasingly realizing that, that their identity now is, not Russia and being the opposite of Russia. Helps us and our partners in the effort to educate people about what the fundamentals of a free society are. So I'm in some ways, one, really grateful for all the philanthropy that's been dedicated to helping Ukraine through the crisis. I hope that we can keep that alive as the questions hopefully will eventually turn to, well, what do we do now to set a policy agenda so that Ukraine can actually thrive as an independent country after this conflict. And maybe that can be an example to the rest of Europe that, if you get the right policies in place, recovery is possible. There's ways to keep smart young people in Europe working here. Those are the kind of questions I think that need a lot more attention.
No, absolutely. And I think in a way it reminds of how after the collapse of the Soviet Union, how in these, let's say, post-Soviet economies, typically there's a strong anti-communist and anti-collectivist sentiment that I think it's very helpful to see at the European Union policy level sometimes the let's say new Europe reminding old Europe about its own values.
Yes.
Then, of course, apart from the rule of law discussion, where you see that there's problems with the rule of law in Poland, Hungary, but across all of these countries that are typically also not having the same number of years of experience with democracy. So it's double. It's double. I mean, there's good things, there's bad things, and actually that brings me to my next question, which I think is really key for Atlas, for the liberty movement. So where do we define it? Is Donald Trump part of it? Is some, I don't know, some leftist that may be good on free speech or whatever, but bad on economics, part of it? I mean, these are of course fair trade-offs, and yeah. What's your view on that, and how is Atlas coping with this challenge?
It's a very tricky question. One of the things that we talk about within our team is how we really don't want to be in the business of being gatekeepers or imposing litmus tests. There are, of course, some figures who are kind of beyond the pale, and there's attitudes that I think are really that stain our movement. So we're really careful to not associate with those who just trade in identity politics and have that as their focus, and who denigrate groups of people and who think in this collectivist way. It's sort of anathema to what we're all about. But we're really, but there are people of goodwill who in the U.S. that have worked with the Trump administration and actually got some good things done. So I don't want to be dismissive of that. I know that there are some populist parties in different parts of Europe that are actually working more constructively towards free market solutions and curbing the excesses of bureaucracy than they are indulging in the untasteful parts of that agenda. So I think that we're, as Atlas Network, we want to be sort of an open tent and welcome people who think they belong, and where we can really make a difference is by elevating what we see as the most inspiring and valuable work, and thereby we can maybe encourage some of these groups that are a little bit on the fringe, that don't share all of our values. I'd like to think that what we can do is persuade them that the way forward is really about being inclusive at the same time that you're standing up for some of these fundamental principles about individual liberty and restraining expansive government. Not sure if that was a satisfying answer, but it's definitely a challenging question you posed.
Yeah. No, it is, and yeah, like I think it's hard to give a definitive answer, but I think you're absolutely right not to try to be a gatekeeper or anything, and also, like you say, these things are in flux. Sometimes you have largely bad movements that may be good on a few things, or the other way around, largely good movement that is bad on a few things. Yeah, I think it's
so much like country by country context. It's really difficult for us to evaluate from afar. So we try to focus on what we know we are confident in celebrating, and just don't spend too much energy trying to analyze the fringes and weigh judgment from afar.
Yes, because, like, for example, in identity politics, let's say historic in the last 30, 40 years, this was typically whatever, KKK, David Duke. But now with the whole woke movement, I mean, I'm not somebody who's like trying to talk only about woke. That's probably also sometimes a bit of a problem. But I think it cannot be denied that there is something like a woke movement, and that they are quite keen on identity politics. There's the woke versus racist meme on YouTube, which is so funny. I think, like, basically about a woke and a racist fan that happen to agree on everything. I just to say as an example that everything is in flux all the time, and movements are not clearly defined, and sometimes center-left movement that is largely good when it comes to non-economic things suddenly degrades into real identity politics, right?
So we've been making a conscious effort to try to speak to groups sort of outside of what we used to call like our bubble. Because we do think that our message should be more appealing. When you really look at the goals of it, trying to help people who've been sort of left behind because of obstacles in their way that government has created by bad economic policy. Like, we should be able to have this language of talking about solving poverty and talk to groups that start with leftist assumptions and may see that our intentions are very genuine, and we can work out, the pros and cons of our different strategies. So we want to talk outside that bubble. At the same time, it's been more difficult to define the bubble because of just how much energy goes into the identity politics and these culture wars. And we try to steer clear of some of that and focus on what we're really confident in and where we know our partners can make a difference.
Okay. And then next question, often you hear people disappointed, not only with party politics, but also with what I would call para-politics, sort of basically the kind of stuff that we're doing, journalism, advocacy, think tanky stuff, NGOs. You often hear people say, why don't I just focus on my family and my business and I stay out of politics? Which in a way is sort of, you could say, a libertarian approach, leave me alone. But then on the other hand, politics may get interested in you if you're not interested, right? So what's your answer to these people that I think would act largely out of disappointment?
Yeah, well, I think you said that really well. You may not take an interest in politics, but politics will take an interest in you. My dream would be for people to really not care because so little was at stake in the upcoming election, because there were protections of individual liberty, and some people bemoan the lack of voting turnout in different elections in the states. I think that used to be a sign of health because people didn't feel that everything was at stake, depending on who would be in the White House. We now have higher turnout because I think there is much more at stake, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So I guess the message I want to send to people that are just burned out is that I certainly understand the temptation and don't begrudge anyone from just focusing on what's in front of them and that their family. Those should always be the top priorities. But I also think that one of the real one of the things that seems scarce in our modern world is a sense of meaning. And I think that if more people were aware of the these sort of poorly funded but scrappy efforts to change hearts and minds in order to reestablish a consensus around free society, institutions, and ideas, I think they'd find that really inspiring and something they'd want to get more involved in. So, on one level, I think we can't afford to give up. There are big challenges. The stakes are high if we let a little political elite rule us and we kind of give up our rights as citizens. And we certainly had a taste of that for COVID. And at the same time, I think that if you had my vantage point where you get to see all these efforts around the world, you'd actually be amazed at how much progress is happening and how much professionalism is now in the ranks of these freedom movement organizations that are trying to affect politics without being directly involved in politics. And it's just really rewarding. So anyway, that would be my pitch, that if you're feeling like you want more meaning in your life, that you're tired taking long vacations, that there's actually some great people to partner with who are doing things in sometimes high stakes environments where their own safety is compromised by standing up for what's right in the Republic of Georgia, in Ukraine, and further afield, really.
No, I think that's definitely a very good answer, actually, and especially as you mentioned the COVID crisis. I'm sure many people that were not particularly outspoken on politics, that many of these people, their eyes have been opened by what suddenly can happen. Suddenly in a time span of a few weeks, there was a ban on making unnecessary trips, and this was easy to debunk as unnecessary because already then it was not the case in every country. In certain countries, like in Sweden, for example, a different policy option was chosen to merely inform the people about the danger of COVID. Don't cough into your grandma's mouth, and use your brain a little bit, and I mean, if you look at any statistics, this approach has been vindicated now, and I'm sure some people have gone a rather questionable path in response to the COVID policy excesses, but I'm sure there's still a lot of people out there that are a lot more open to the idea that we have to be careful with, government overreach and everything than before this crisis. So yeah.
Yeah, like I think this is such an important opportunity for the liberty movement and people who are sympathetic with this disposition to just make the case that, hey, we tried the top-down rules and we found out that they didn't work, and that there was a lot of disinformation from those at the top of government, those in public health institutions, and that where we really saw resilience was in civil society, in the small businesses that learned how to operate under really oppressive conditions. I think it was a great experiment in what works, and what worked was bottom up, and that should sort of prepare us for the next crisis about not trusting, one size fits all mandates coming from government. We should all have our antenna up and waiting for bad policy like that, because it can wreak havoc.
Last question. If you have to name 3 things that could be improved for the liberty movement, the international liberty movement, to better coordinate and cooperate, sort of, what would those 3 things be? I'm putting you on the spot, but
you are putting me on the spot. Come up with 3. Let's see. I think that maybe one of the things is to really lean into the challenge of thinking about like the concrete changes that we can create. Sometimes the policy reforms that our partners work on seem sort of small. It doesn't feel like the Berlin Wall is going to tumble down, but I think it's really important for the credibility of institutions to show you can win over and over again, and you're not just a discussion club, which I think is what kind of limited the ambitions of some groups in the past, where they thought, oh, we're just keeping ideas alive without the hope of implementing them. A lot of our partners have turned to the challenge of finding places where reform is possible and doing that hard work. So I'd love to see more in that direction. A second thing would be to just be a little more open-minded about how we communicate our principles, because I think there are a lot of people who have been disenfranchised by the rhetoric on both the hard left and the extreme right and so on, and they're looking for pragmatic solutions. So it's not a time for us to you sort of require everybody to have read their Milton Friedman or F.A. Hayek books. Let's start by talking about the change we want in society, more opportunity for low income people. And let's, figure out what solutions we can bring to bear and start the conversation there. Cause I think we could appeal to a much bigger group. And then the last thing is that, I've become a big believer in how organizations that engage with their peers tend to innovate faster. If you're sort of on an island and just comparing, trying to do things a little bit better than you did last year, that's fine. But you can be a little bit more disruptive if you're aware of the innovations that are happening thanks to pro-liberty activists in other countries and other settings. And that's really what Atlas Network exists to try to facilitate, is sort of this group learning together experience that makes us all a little bit better. So yeah, more engagement with your peers, more engagement with outside groups, and a real focus on what we can do to measurably make progress, I think gets us pointed in the right direction.
All right. Well, I think those are 3 very concrete and interesting suggestions. So thank you very much, Brad Lips. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and I wish you and the Atlas Network all the best of luck.
Thank you. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
The Brussels Report podcast.